puppy sleeps outside a hospital every night. When a doctor finds out why, he breaks down in tears. A small puppy had been seen every night, sleeping outside the entrance of a busy hospital. The hospital staff noticed him there, curled up by the door in a small patch of grass. His fur was unkempt, his eyes filled with sadness, and his tiny body shivered from the cold. No matter how much anyone tried to shoo him away or offer him food, he would always return to that same spot. No one knew where he had come from or why he stayed, but he was always there, faithfully waiting as if hoping for something. One night, Dr. Samuel, a kind and experienced doctor, finished his late shift. He had seen the puppy before but never gave it much thought, assuming it was just another stray. However, on this particular night, something stirred in him as he saw the little dog trembling in the freezing air. He decided to get closer, crouching down to inspect the pup more closely. As he reached out to pet the puppy, it didn't run away. Instead, it looked up at him with big, sorrowful eyes. Dr. Samuel felt a pang in his chest, sensing that the puppy's presence there wasn't by chance. He couldn't shake the feeling and, driven by an unusual curiosity, decided to ask around about the dog's history. He questioned some of the hospital staff and a janitor who had been working the night shifts. What he learned shocked him to his core. One of the nurses recalled seeing an old man brought into the hospital a couple of weeks earlier. He had collapsed on the street just outside, and the paramedics rushed him inside. The man was severely ill, and despite their best efforts, he didn't make it through the night. She remembered how the man had been alone, clutching a piece of cloth, and how no family had come to claim his body. Then it hit Dr. Samuel like a wave: the puppy must have belonged to the old man. The little dog had been waiting by the door for his owner to return, completely unaware that the man he loved so dearly was gone. Night after night, he stayed in that same spot, hoping for a reunion that would never come. The realization was too much for Dr. Samuel to bear. His heart ached, and tears welled up in his eyes. He had seen many tragedies in his career, but this one was different. There was something so pure and heartbreaking about the loyalty of the tiny puppy. The little dog had stayed out in the cold, clinging to hope, waiting for someone who would never come back. Overcome with emotion, Dr. Samuel made a decision. He couldn't let the puppy continue to suffer like this. Gently, he scooped the little dog into his arms, stroking its fur softly. "You've been waiting long enough," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It's time to come home." From that day on, the puppy had a new home with Dr. Samuel. Though the dog never forgot his old owner, he slowly learned to trust and love again, finding comfort in the warmth of a new family. And every night, as the puppy curled up at the foot of Dr. Samuel's bed, the doctor was reminded of the profound lesson he had learned: love and loyalty, no matter how simple, can move even the hardest of hearts. As the days passed, the puppy began to adapt to his new life with Dr. Samuel. The once fragile, trembling dog grew stronger, though the sadness in his eyes hadn't completely disappeared. He often looked out the window as if still waiting for someone. Dr. Samuel noticed this, and while it pained him to see the little dog still yearning for his lost owner, he was determined to help him heal. One weekend, Dr. Samuel decided to take the puppy, whom he had named Max, for a walk in the nearby park. It was a sunny day, and the fresh air seemed to lift Max's spirits. He bounded around, sniffing the flowers, chasing after butterflies, and wagging his tail, a sight that brought a smile to Dr. Samuel's face. However, something unexpected happened during their walk. As they were passing by a bench near the park's fountain, Max suddenly stopped and began pulling at the leash, barking in a way that Samuel had never seen before. The doctor followed Max's lead, confused, and they stopped near a man sitting alone on the bench. The man, who appeared to be in his 50s, looked disheveled and tired. His clothes were worn, and he had a small bag beside him, but it was his eyes that caught Dr. Samuel's attention. They were filled with the same sadness he had seen in Max's eyes when he first found him. Max continued to tug at the leash, barking and wagging his tail, as if recognizing something in the stranger. "Do you know him, Max?" Dr. Samuel asked softly, kneeling beside the dog. The man looked up at the doctor and the puppy with a curious, almost haunted expression. "That's a fine dog you've got there," the man said, his voice hoarse. "He reminds me of a dog I used to see with an old friend of mine, a street vendor, but that man passed away a while ago." Dr. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. "You knew him?" he asked, his voice shaking. The man nodded. "Yeah, he had a dog that looked just like this one. Loyal thing, always by his side. I hadn't seen the dog in weeks since the old man died, but this one, it's like seeing a ghost." Max pressed his nose against the man's knee, whimpering softly. Tears welled up in the stranger's eyes, and he whispered, "I miss him too, boy." Dr. Samuel realized that this man had been one of the few people in the old man's life a connection to the past Max was still clinging to. The man looked lost, just like the puppy had been, wandering without a friend. And in that moment, Dr. Samuel understood that maybe, just maybe, the puppy and this man were meant to find each other too. "Why don't you come with us?" Dr. Samuel suggested. "We could use some company, and I think Max would like to spend some time with an old friend of his." The man hesitated, unsure, but the warmth in Dr. Samuel's voice and the affectionate nudging from Max seemed to break through the wall he had built around himself. Slowly, he nodded, wiping away his tears. As they walked together, Dr. Samuel knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. He had set out to save one heartbroken puppy, but now, in a twist of fate, he might have found a way to mend two broken souls at once. As time passed, Dr. Samuel, Max, and the stranger, whose name he soon learned was Robert, began spending more time together. Their bond deepened with each encounter, though it was clear that both Max and Robert were still healing in their own ways. Dr. Samuel had always been a compassionate man, but something about this situation touched him deeply. He saw in Max and Robert the same pain, the same sense of loss, and it stirred something within him that he hadn't felt in years. Dr. Samuel had his own past, a past filled with memories of a family he had lost long ago. A car accident had taken his wife and son from him years before, and though he had thrown himself into his work to cope, he had never fully recovered. The long hours at the hospital had helped him push away the grief, but seeing Max's loyalty and Robert's sadness brought it all rushing back. In their pain, he saw a reflection of his own. One evening, as the three of them sat together in the park, Robert finally opened up about his connection to Max's former owner. "I knew Charlie for years," Robert said quietly, stroking Max's head as the dog rested on his lap. "He wasn't just some old man, he was my closest friend. We used to sell trinkets together, out on the streets. You know, small things, hand-carved wooden toys, little keepsakes." Dr. Samuel listened intently, feeling the weight of Robert's words. It was clear that Charlie had been more than just a friend to Robert, he had been a lifeline. Robert had been living on the streets for years, drifting from place to place, but Charlie had always been there for him. They had looked out for each other, sharing what little they had and finding solace in their companionship. And then, suddenly, Charlie was gone, leaving Robert feeling lost and alone. "When Charlie got sick, I tried to take care of him the best I could," Robert continued, his voice breaking. "But I wasn't enough. I didn't have the money to get him proper treatment. By the time he collapsed outside this hospital, it was too late. I didn't even get to say goodbye." Tears welled up in Robert's eyes, and Max, sensing his distress, nudged him gently with his nose. Dr. Samuel reached out, placing a comforting hand on Robert's shoulder. "You did what you could," Dr. Samuel said softly. "And Max here, his proof of the love you both shared. He's still here, and so are you." Robert nodded, though the pain of Charlie's loss still weighed heavily on him. He had been wandering the streets ever since, unsure of where to go or what to do next. Max, too, had been waiting, hoping for a reunion that could never happen. But in each other, they had found a small flicker of hope, something to hold on to. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Samuel invited Robert to stay with him, at least for a while, until he could figure out his next steps. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was better than leaving him out on the streets. Robert hesitated at first, not wanting to be a burden, but eventually, he accepted. The warmth of a home, no matter how temporary, was something he hadn't known in years. Max seemed to grow even more attached to Robert, following him around the house, curling up beside him at night, and offering comfort in ways that only a dog could. It was as if Max knew that Robert needed him just as much as he had needed Charlie. The bond they formed was undeniable, and Dr. Samuel couldn't help but feel a sense of peace as he watched them together. But healing wasn't a linear process. There were nights when Robert would wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by nightmares of the streets and the friends he had lost. There were moments when Max would sit by the door, staring out as if waiting for someone to return. And there were times when Dr. Samuel would find himself lost in his own thoughts, remembering the family he had once had and the pain that still lingered in the corners of his heart. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Dr. Samuel decided to share his own story. "I haven't always been alone either," he began, his voice quiet. "I had a family once. A wife and a son. We were happy, or at least I thought we were. But life has a way of taking things from you when you least expect it." Robert looked up, surprised. He hadn't known much about Dr. Samuel's past, only that he was a kind man who had taken him and Max in when they needed it most. "We were in a car accident," Dr. Samuel continued, his eyes distant as he recalled the painful memory. "I survived, but they didn't. After that, I threw myself into my work. It was the only way I knew how to cope. But the truth is, I've been running from my own grief for years." The room fell silent, the weight of Dr. Samuel's words hanging in the air. Robert didn't know what to say, but Max, sensing the sadness in the room, nudged Dr. Samuel's hand with his nose, offering a small, comforting gesture. "You're not alone anymore," Robert finally said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "None of us are." Dr. Samuel looked at Robert and then at Max, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was carrying his burden alone. The three of them, Dr. Samuel, Robert, and Max, had all experienced loss in their own ways. But together, they were slowly learning how to heal. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but step by step, they were finding their way forward. As the days turned into weeks, Robert began to rebuild his life. With Dr. Samuel's help, he found work at a local woodworking shop, using the skills he had honed over the years with Charlie. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Max became a familiar sight around the neighborhood, always at Robert's side, his tail wagging and his eyes filled with a new sense of purpose. Dr. Samuel, too, found that his heart was beginning to heal. The weight of his past still lingered, but it no longer felt as unbearable as it once had. He had found a new family, one that, though unconventional, had brought a sense of hope back into his life. One afternoon, as they walked through the park together, Robert turned to Dr. Samuel with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "I think Charlie would be happy to see us like this. He always believed that no matter how bad things got, there was always a chance for something better." Dr. Samuel smiled, looking down at Max, who was trotting happily beside them. "I think he'd be proud," he agreed. "We've all come a long way." And they had. In their shared pain, they had found strength. In their grief, they had found love. And in each other, they had found a second chance at life. As the days turned into months, life for Dr. Samuel, Robert, and Max began to settle into a peaceful rhythm. Robert had found steady work at the woodworking shop, where his natural talent for crafting beautiful pieces of furniture and decorative items earned him the respect of his boss and co-workers. It wasn't just a job, it gave him a renewed sense of purpose, something that had been missing for so long. Max, meanwhile, had become the heart of their little family. His once sad eyes were now bright with energy, and he had bonded deeply with both men. Every morning, he would eagerly wait by the door for Robert to take him to the park before work, and every evening, he would curl up by the fireplace in Dr. Samuel's living room, content in the warmth of his new home. For Dr. Samuel, life had taken a turn he never expected. His days at the hospital remained busy, filled with the usual stresses of being a doctor, but coming home to Max and Robert gave him a new sense of fulfillment. There was something comforting in knowing he wasn't returning to an empty house anymore. The quiet evenings filled with shared meals, stories, and laughter slowly chipped away at the loneliness that had plagued him for so long. But life, as it often does, soon threw another challenge their way. One evening, after a particularly long day at the hospital, Dr. Samuel returned home to find Robert sitting on the porch, his face drawn and worried. Max was lying at his feet, unusually quiet, his ears flattened against his head. "What's wrong?" Dr. Samuel asked, sensing the tension in the air. Robert hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I got a letter today," he said, holding up a crumpled piece of paper. "It's from the city council. They're clearing out one of the old neighborhoods where I used to stay with Charlie. They're turning it into some fancy development, and anyone who was still living there, legally or not, is being pushed out." Dr. Samuel frowned. "Are they offering any help or relocation assistance?" Robert shook his head. "Not really. It's just another reminder of how little people like us matter to those in charge. They'll tear it all down without a second thought. Charlie and I used to talk about fixing up one of the old buildings there, turning it." Dr. Samuel sat down beside Robert, the weight of the news settling in. He could see how much this neighborhood meant to Robert. It was a place tied to his memories of Charlie and their shared hope for a better future. Even though Robert had moved on from the streets, the news hit him hard. It was more than just a physical loss, it was the destruction of a piece of his past, one that still held meaning for him. "I'm sorry, Robert," Dr. Samuel said quietly. "I know how much that place meant to you." Robert nodded, his eyes distant. "It's just hard, you know? I've made peace with losing Charlie, but losing that neighborhood feels like losing him all over again. It was the last place where we had something real." Dr. Samuel could feel the pain in Robert's voice, and he wanted to help. "Maybe there's something we can do," he suggested. "What if we tried to fight it? Maybe we could get the community involved, raise awareness. If enough people speak up, they might reconsider their plans." Robert looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "You really think that could work?" "It's worth a shot," Dr. Samuel said with a determined smile. "We've seen stranger things happen. Besides, you're not alone in this fight. We'll face it together." That night, they sat around the kitchen table, drafting letters and emails to local organizations, city officials, and community leaders. They contacted old friends from the neighborhood, as well as local activists, hoping to rally support. Max, sensing the energy in the room, lay by their feet, offering quiet companionship as they worked late into the night. Over the next few weeks, their efforts began to gain traction. The local newspaper picked up their story, and soon, more people were talking about the unfairness of displacing those who had lived in the old neighborhood for years. Robert found himself at the center of a small but passionate movement, speaking out at city council meetings and organizing protests. It was an unfamiliar role for him, but one that gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Dr. Samuel stood by Robert's side every step of the way, offering his support and using his connections to amplify their message. He saw the fire in Robert's eyes as he fought for something he believed in, and it reminded him of the man he had first met on that park bench, someone who had lost so much but was still willing to fight for a better future. Despite their best efforts, however, the city council remained unmoved. The development plans continued, and one by one, the buildings in the old neighborhood were torn down. It was a painful blow, but Robert refused to give up. Even in the face of defeat, he found solace in the fact that they had tried, that they had fought for something meaningful. One afternoon, as the last of the old buildings was demolished, Robert and Dr. Samuel stood together on the outskirts of the site, watching the dust settle. Max sat quietly between them, his head resting on Robert's knee. "It's gone," Robert said softly, his voice tinged with sadness. "But I guess that's life, isn't it? Things change, whether we want them to or not." Dr. Samuel nodded, understanding the weight of those words. "But you didn't let it go without a fight," he said. "And that matters. You gave it your all, and you should be proud of that." Robert was silent for a moment, then he turned to Dr. Samuel, a small smile playing on his lips. "I guess you're right. It's just hard to say goodbye to something that meant so much." "It always is," Dr. Samuel said quietly, thinking of his own past losses. "But sometimes, when one door closes, another one opens. You never know what the future holds." Robert looked down at Max, who wagged his tail gently, as if offering comfort. "Maybe you're right," he said. "Maybe this is just the start of something new." In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal. The fight to save the neighborhood had been lost, but Robert had gained something far more important in the process: a sense of belonging, a renewed hope for the future, and a family he never expected to find. Dr. Samuel, too, felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that they had faced the challenge together and come out stronger on the other side. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Robert turned to Dr. Samuel with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Charlie and I always dreamed of building something for people like us, a place where we could give back, where we could help others find their way. Dr. Samuel nodded, intrigued. And you still want to do that? Robert smiled. I think it's time to make that dream a reality. Maybe we couldn't save the old neighborhood, but we can still create something new. Something that honors Charlie's memory and helps others who are struggling. Dr. Samuel's heart swelled with pride. I think that's a wonderful idea, Robert. And I'll be with you every step of the way. Max barked in agreement, his tail wagging furiously as if he understood the significance of the moment. And so, together, they began to plan for the future, a future that, though uncertain, was filled with hope and the promise of new beginnings. In the end, it wasn't just about what they had lost, but about what they had found in each other: family, friendship, and the strength to keep moving forward, no matter what life threw their way. The idea of creating a community space ignited something deep within Robert. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a true sense of direction. The idea had always lingered in his mind, but it was Dr. Samuel's unwavering support and the bond they had formed that made it seem possible. Together, they could take the memory of Charlie and the dreams they once shared and turn them into a reality. The following morning, Robert sat down with Dr. Samuel over a cup of coffee and a notepad, eager to begin planning. So, where do we start? Robert asked, his fingers tapping anxiously against the table. Dr. Samuel smiled, already sensing Robert's excitement. Well, first, we need to figure out exactly what we want this place to be. Do we want it to be just a shelter, or do we want to offer services, maybe a space where people can learn new skills? Robert thought for a moment, his eyes narrowing in concentration. I think we should focus on helping people find their footing again, like Charlie helped me. A place where people can get shelter, sure, but also where they can learn a trade, maybe get some education or legal help. Somewhere that doesn't just give people a bed but gives them the tools to rebuild their lives. Dr. Samuel nodded. That sounds like a great foundation. But we'll need funding, a space, volunteers. It's a big project, but if we take it one step at a time, I think we can pull it off. Robert looked out the window, his thoughts drifting back to the old neighborhood. You think people will care enough to help? People care more than you might think, Dr. Samuel replied. And we've already seen that there's a lot of support for causes like this. If we can show people that we're serious and that this is more than just a dream, I believe they'll rally behind us. With that, they spent the next several hours brainstorming ideas, making lists of potential partners and organizations that could help, and discussing what kind of space would be ideal for their vision. The more they talked, the more Robert began to believe that this could really happen. Days turned into weeks, and the idea of the community center began to take shape. Robert, with his newfound confidence, reached out to old contacts, people from the streets, activists who had fought alongside him to save the neighborhood, even former colleagues from the woodworking shop. Dr. Samuel, using his connections from the hospital and his standing in the community, reached out to potential donors and local businesses that might be willing to contribute. It wasn't long before they found a potential location, an old, run-down warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was in dire need of repairs, but it had enough space to house a shelter, a workshop, and a few classrooms. It wasn't much, but it had potential, and the rent was cheap enough that they could afford it with the donations that were already trickling in. One afternoon, as they stood in front of the building, Robert couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and apprehension. It's perfect, he said, though his voice was tinged with doubt. But can we really make this work? Dr. Samuel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We're not doing this alone, Robert. We've got a whole community behind us. And you've come this far. We'll make it work, one step at a time. With that, they began the monumental task of turning the warehouse into a place of hope. Volunteers from the community came together to help with the renovations. Some were skilled tradespeople, while others simply wanted to lend a hand. Local businesses donated materials, and little by little, the space began to transform. Robert threw himself into the work with a level of dedication and passion that surprised even him. Every nail hammered, every wall painted felt like a step toward honoring Charlie's memory. Max was always by his side, happily wagging his tail as he followed Robert around the construction site. As the renovations progressed, Robert and Dr. Samuel held meetings with the community to gather input on what services the center should offer. They decided to name the space Charlie's Corner, a tribute to the man who had inspired the idea. The name quickly caught on, and the story of Charlie's loyalty, compassion, and dreams for a better future resonated with everyone who heard it. One particularly busy evening, as they worked late into the night, Dr. Samuel sat down with Robert on a pile of wooden planks, both men exhausted but content. Max lay beside them, his head resting on Robert's lap. "You know," Robert said, his voice filled with a quiet awe, "I never thought any of this would be possible. If it weren't for you, I'd still be lost out there." Dr. Samuel smiled, shaking his head. "I think you would have found your way eventually. You've got a lot of strength in you, Robert. More than you realize." Robert was quiet for a moment, lost in thought. "I wish Charlie could see this," he said softly. "He'd be proud of what we're building." "I think he does see it," Dr. Samuel replied gently. "And I know he'd be proud." The grand opening of Charlie's Corner came sooner than anyone had anticipated. Word had spread throughout the community, and when the doors finally opened, dozens of people gathered to celebrate. There were former homeless individuals, volunteers, local officials, and even some of Dr. Samuel's colleagues from the hospital. It was a day filled with joy, laughter, and, most importantly, hope. Robert stood at the front of the crowd, holding Max's leash in one hand and a speech he had prepared in the other. As he looked out over the crowd, he felt a lump form in his throat. He had never been one for public speaking, but this moment meant too much for him to stay silent. Clearing his throat, he began. "I don't really know where to start," he said, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger with each word. "A year ago, I was lost. I didn't have a home, I didn't have a direction, and I didn't have hope. But then, thanks to the kindness of one man, and the love of a loyal dog, everything changed." The crowd listened intently as Robert spoke from the heart, telling the story of Charlie, his dreams, and how those dreams had led to the creation of Charlie's Corner. He talked about the people who had come together to make it happen, about the power of community, and about the importance of never giving up, even when things seemed impossible. "Charlie always believed in helping people," Robert continued, his voice filled with emotion. "And I think if he were here today, he'd tell us all that this isn't just a building. It's a place where people can find a second chance. A place where they can rebuild their lives, just like I did." As Robert finished his speech, the crowd erupted into applause. Dr. Samuel stood by his side, pride shining in his eyes. Max barked happily, as if joining in the celebration. From that day forward, Charlie's Corner became a beacon of hope for the community. People who had once felt forgotten and discarded now had a place where they could find support, guidance, and a sense of belonging. Robert found fulfillment in running the center, teaching woodworking to those who wanted to learn, and offering a listening ear to anyone who needed it. Dr. Samuel continued his work at the hospital, but he made it a point to spend as much time at the center as he could. Watching Robert thrive and seeing the impact Charlie's Corner had on the community filled him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. In helping Robert and Max, he had unknowingly helped himself heal as well. As the months passed, the center continued to grow, offering more services and reaching more people than Robert or Dr. Samuel could have ever imagined. It wasn't just a place to stay, it was a place to rebuild, to dream, and to find hope again. One evening, as they sat together outside the center, watching the sunset, Robert turned to Dr. Samuel and smiled. "I think we did it," he said softly. "We finally built something that matters." Dr. Samuel nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. "We did. And it's just the beginning." Max lay contentedly between them, his eyes half closed as he enjoyed the peaceful evening. He had found his family, his home, and his purpose. And in doing so, he had helped two broken men find theirs as well.